Before this episode begins, let's take a moment to speak of Jazz Journalists Association activities. 8 nominees for our 2025 Book of the Year Awards and 15 honorable mentions are posted at jjanews.org, along with other articles from our international membership. And we urge you to take a look at the Jazz Omnibus, the 600-page anthology of 21st century photos and writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, available online and wherever books are sold. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association, an international professional organization of writers, photographers, and broadcasters focused on jazz. I'm Lawrence Peryer, proud JJA member and your host today for a discussion with the editorial team behind an important new book, the Jazz Omnibus, 21st Century Photos and Writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, out now from Cymbal Press. Joining me from the Omnibus are editor David Adler, copy chief Terri Hinte, editorial advisor Howard Mandel, and Gary Stager, the publisher from Cymbal Press. Honorable mention goes to our colleague Patrick Heinle, photo editor for the book, who could not join us today. The Jazz Omnibus is an anthology of works by over 80 international experts in jazz and related music, a compendium of reportage and analysis of the form as it enters its second 100 years. Information about the Jazz Omnibus is available on jazzjournalists.org, cymbalpress.com, Amazon, and wherever you get your books. So, to begin, I'd like to start at the beginning, and I'd like to start with Howard. And I'd like to know, Howard, could you talk to us a little bit about the genesis of this project? What makes the Jazz Journalists Association think it should be in the business of publishing a book?
Well, we thought that it was wise to bring together the writings of our membership during the 20 years since we've been incorporated. Back in the early 90s, before I was president of the JJA, we did have a couple compendiums of writers' works over the year that we really distributed amongst ourselves like fanzines, but they were just mimeograph copy things. A couple years ago, Gary was on a panel discussion that the JJA held during a Jazz Awards ceremony online. And he was talking about the business model that Cymbal Press was incorporating. And I thought, why don't we try to do something for our members, for journalism, jazz journalism, and do a compilation, work with Gary on this, and put out a real book that's substantial and represents what we've all been doing. So I don't think anybody else was going to do that. And this seemed like an easy way to go. I didn't have to I talked to Gary about it. He said, yeah, we can work on that. So I didn't have to draw up proposals and enter lots of queries. We had an agreement. And I think that Cymbal Press's business model, as I say, works for this kind of project. So why not? Yes, it's go.
Well, lest listeners think that you and I were comparing notes beforehand, I just want to say that you set up my next question nicely, so thank you. I'm really curious, Gary, about how Cymbal got involved, and I was going to ask, was this later in the process? Was this a shopping or a sale type process? But can you talk a little bit to our listeners about Cymbal and what that model is that Howard was referring to that makes you so special and different?
Well, sure. A little bit of my backstory. I grew up an aspiring jazz musician until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me, and then transitioned into ardent fan. And I often joke, the last living human paying for jazz. And I spend a lot of time in clubs and concert halls and traveling around the world and hanging out with friends who are great musicians and earning a living working in education, mostly as a teacher educator. As an educator, we started a publishing company about a dozen years ago called Constructing Modern Knowledge Press, and we've published about 20 books that have given voice to educators who otherwise wouldn't have had a distribution medium for sharing their work with the world. Around the start of the pandemic, I started thinking about how I could help my friends in the jazz community keep their stories alive. I had heard that my friend Phil Woods's autobiography was kicking around and no one was interested in publishing it. And I thought we could probably do that. And we added some material at the beginning and at the end to situate it in a context and massaged it into a great book that was actually Book of the Year from the Jazz Journalists Association in 2021. And then we were off to the races. And the Jazz Omnibus is our sixth book as Cymbal Press. It infuriated me the way authors and artists and writers and journalists were being treated, not just on the pay side. No one is getting rich from an endeavor like this, but from the investment of time and treasure and inspiration that goes into writing something only to have it go out of print 3 or 4 months later, or to have a publisher who does nothing to promote it. I thought it was really important for these ideas to be evergreen, that there's no reason for anything to ever go out of print. And when Howard asked me to participate in the panel, I think it was a Sunday morning or something, and I followed a legitimate publisher from one of the university presses, and I heard how meager their sales expectations were, and I recognized how authors and artists weren't getting the sort of care that they deserved. It sort of reaffirmed that what we were doing was the right thing. And then soon after that, not only did Howard come to us with the idea for this book, but just about everyone who's interested in writing in this field thought, oh, well, maybe you guys can help. And so we've learned a few things along the way. And like I said, this is our sixth book, and I'm thrilled. It's an absolutely gorgeous. The hardcover is the most deluxe edition we've done with a dust jacket. And we hope that this will be part of collectors' libraries and school and university libraries as well. And it represents, the state of the art in music, writing, criticism, and photography, the first part of the 21st century.
Yeah, it's a beautiful physical object. So my hat's off on that front.
And I should give credit to my partner, Sylvia Martinez, who just goes along with my harebrained schemes and actually makes the trains run on time and makes the books happen. I just get her into trouble by saying yes to things that I shouldn't say yes to.
Since you like the way the book looks, I want to give credit to Lauren Deutsch, whose photograph of Roscoe Mitchell and the emanations of energy from his horn are really making this a book that it's a pleasure to have people judge it by its cover.
Yeah, that's wonderful. David, can you talk to me a little bit about sort of the size and the scope of the book? And specifically what I mean is, did you start off with a target page count, or when did the scope of the book reveal itself to you in terms of what it needed and wanted to be?
That's a good question. I don't remember the number that we envisioned at the start. It just continually expanded. And it was from a surfeit of, just good material and, not having to cut short, some of the longer material, although we did cut. It just grew and grew. To fast forward, when it landed in the mail and I opened it, and it seemed right just to be that size, and it really fills those pages. So it didn't seem like a liability in the end.
We should say that we made a call for submissions from all the members of the JJA. And there's about 250 members of the Jazz Journalists Association. That's writers, broadcasters, photographers, and videographers, and people who work in new media. We looked at the submissions that we were getting back, and we really didn't want to turn down anything that a member submitted. Everybody could submit 3 pieces, so we had some choices, and we got back to them and asked them for this piece rather than the other. But I felt like this is to represent the membership, and I hope represents very good jazz journalism, but in fact, it represents all of jazz journalism, kind of the way jazz journalism has been covering music in the last 20 years. So we've got reviews, interviews, analytic pieces, some quasi-academic writing. This is what our members are doing, and we wanted to show all of that.
Something that struck me as a reader perusing even just the table of contents was it really is reflective of the expansiveness of what jazz has come to mean over the last 20 years. For somebody that is going to go out of their way to pick this up and to flip through it, they're going to see very quickly that this is not, a museum piece, or this isn't about sanctifying a particular era. This is a very vibrant sort of living reflection of a music that's evolving as we get further and further into this century. Terri, something I'm really curious about in your role as copy chief. I think of different aspects of that role, and I wonder, how is it different in a project like this where it's previously published pieces. At least that's my assumption, is that they were all previously published. Please disavow me if I'm wrong there. But how does that make it different in terms of what you have to do? Are you getting pieces that have already been well edited? Is it less work for you? Like, could you talk a little bit about your role and sort of the quality control part of it?
Right. Well, I have a long history as a proofreader and copy editor, like 50 plus years. And I've worked on books, magazines, newspapers, at Fantasy Records, thousands of sets of liner notes. I enjoy the work. And after our reading group of 5 readers turned into 3 people, Howard, David, and myself, that just seemed something that was a natural for me. We didn't discuss it in advance, but if I look at a page, I'm going to, the mistakes will jump out at me. And so that's what happened. I gave the book several readings cover to cover, and we all read each of the pieces, any number of times. And it's when you start putting any kind of compilation together, you're looking at the totality of it and trying to achieve some consistency in obviously the way it looks, but also the way it reads. The ultimate is for the reader to enjoy the experience and not be disturbed by errors.
Terri, did you, or I can open it up to David or anybody else who wants to answer, did you have to give much thought, or what type of thought went into sort of narrative flow and the sort of running order, if you will, of the pieces? That sounds like it's a little bit alluded to in your answer there.
Could I speak to that? So the sections were the one word kind of buzzwords, seekers, legends, scenes, sounds. Those just came to me after some aspects we kind of struggled with. How is this gonna play out? How are we gonna group this? And I knew it just had to be zingier than what we initially came up with, which I can't even remember what it was, but just like 5 or 6 sections would seem like a good way to kind of chop it up and into digestible and also coherent subdivisions, like the families of pieces, the kinds of pieces that we had. Just wanted to also echo what Terri said about it, feeling she enjoys the work. I do too. It seemed this was a good fit for me. Also, I had, to back up a few years, I had already been editing a JJA newsletter, Jazz Notes, for about 5-7 years, something like that. And then it transitioned to online, which I had some hand in transitioning that to online. And then I've been involved in the JJA in various less formalized ways for years after that. So Howard approached me, already having had a history of, editing content and things for the organization. And I just enjoy it. And I'm a freelancer. It felt very natural to, I think that's another word that Terri used. And I'll just say, thank goodness that Terri was protecting me from my own idiocies as I sometimes too quickly went over things, but always with just that extra layer of expertise. And to back up also to another, I think the beginning of the question, which was I've lost the train of thought. Let me hand it over to Terri, and it might come to me.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Terri. Yeah, please.
I'd like to say that it's always helpful to have more than one set of eyes on any topic. And, we're so subject to internet errors now. I mean, even blogs and any kind of unedited copy that reaches the internet, which is a lot of music sites. I don't know, man. If someone is misspelling Thelonious's name, they should find another line of work, or hire out for an editor. It's upsetting to me that this appears in print, that we can't get the names right. So having several people look at this copy, including Sylvia. I mean, Sylvia also found errors, and it's all hands on deck. And the result was worth all of that labor.
I think what's a little surprising to me when I hear you say that is I came in with the assumption that the pieces had already been pretty well edited. So it's interesting that they went from, go ahead, Howard, please.
Yeah, well, we did get most of the pieces had been published before, so they had been edited. However, we're creating new texts out of these. I mean, you have to feed it into another process. We were getting document submissions, and we had to turn that into consistent type. Headlines, the bibliography was all new, and that was a very complicated process. The index, all of this material that, you kind of take for granted, but the addendums, the table of contents, the copyright pages, all of these little details. So yes, we worked very hard on the submissions as they came in, and most of them were edited for publication, and that was the way they went. David mentioned shortening a couple. I worked on Ashley Kahn's piece about the new expatriates, American musicians who are currently living in Europe, and he'd gotten an award, a Deems Taylor Award, I believe, for that article, but it ran another third as long in its original iteration, which was online at wbgo.org. And we just didn't have the space for it in the book. So I had to work on that with Ashley to try to compress it to a way that it made sense as a chapter, a long chapter, but worth it, but not out of proportion to some of the other pieces in the book. We also, David and I think Terri had a hand on this too, resequenced the book a couple times. I printed everything out and started shuffling the articles to see what of the sections they really fit in. And yeah, I was looking for variety and pacing in the way those articles would sequence. But I really don't think this is necessarily a book you read from cover to cover. It's got so much variety in it. Somebody can open it up and scan the table of contents and say, well, I'm really interested in this artist. I'm going to read that. Or I never heard of this artist. Who's this? And check them out. Or I know that writer, or I don't know this. There are many ways of entry that this book allows, I think.
Yeah, the process of discovery is really a neat part of it. It really is a companion in that way that you can sort of leave it on your bedside or in next to your favorite sitting chair or what have you, and just pick it up and enjoy it for a longer period of time. Gary, I'm curious, in so much as you wear a commercial hat or have a commercial role in this, I'm curious, did you feel as though there was anything that sort of had to be there or had to be included in the book? Did you think about, I guess, commercial requirements and where that met the editorial requirement?
I think that either Howard or David might have something to say about that as well. I mean, the fact that the Sonny Rollins, Ted Pankin piece leads off the book is one aspect of, I guess, a bigger name or something. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I think more broadly, yeah. Like, was there any sort of vision as to, a minimum viable or a minimum requirement of, certain people or certain scenes or, just were there any guiding principles of like, we'll know we'll have enough when we meet these requirements? Very curious about that.
Well, I was going to say, and I was thinking about this in terms of your original question as well. We're unconstrained by traditional rules and traditions and practices and page counts. And so we were quite happy with, as long as the book could be physically printed, and there are break-even points and points of diminishing returns if the book gets too big or too small for that matter, of it making any financial sense on the production side. But otherwise, we left things completely in the hands of the experts at the JJA to come to us. And then, as I said, my partner Sylvia spent a bunch of time on the indexing, which we've kind of vowed to never do again. It's one of those things that you think AI would be really good at, but no one's bothering to make AI any good at it. It's a lot of monkey work, but it was important for this volume because we think it's going to be evergreen and because it's going to be next to people's phonograph or their comfy chair or their bedside table, making sure that they could find that. But as Howard said, the cover jumps off the screen when you're on an Amazon site, and it prints really nicely on a t-shirt, and that helps a lot. We spent some time at wordsmithing for the title of the book and I think Howard came up with Omnibus, which seemed to work pretty well. But otherwise, maybe we're not smart enough to know what we're not supposed to do. But we were quite happy with the product and letting the process govern what the end product actually would come out to be.
We were concerned, when we looked through things and said, well, how can we not have a piece about X and so? And then we dug a little further and often had a piece around X and so, we found one. And I write in the introduction about some of the things that aren't in the book, but we weren't going out to write like a history of the first quarter of the 21st century. We were showing what our members have done and what kind of coverage there exists. And I think that there are big stories that aren't in the book, and I tried to allude to them. And maybe that's something that if we did a second book, we would really try to target some
Yeah.
pieces on some of the bigger issues, the underlying issues, the ecology. We were able to cover a lot of ground with almost 90 contributions, photos and
Right.
articles both. So there's an international aspect to it. We were also looking to make sure that we represented women as writers, as subject matter, and that we were even-handed as much as possible about that, and looking for not all the coverage to be about things that happen in New York. So, geographic distribution. And those were some of the editorial decisions I think we made.
Those were some big ones. It's about curation and working with what we got in to craft the strongest kind of material that would hang together in the different sections. But Howard was decisive, so when we say editorial advisor, that's not someone who's like checking in now and then, but like someone who was very intimately involved in, filling whatever, if there were, just obvious gaps or just accounting for them, for the gaps, like he did in his intro, which was very thorough about, what this book is versus what this book is not. But it was really, self-selecting from our membership and kind of crafting us, a large volume story out of that, what we got in.
Could you talk a little bit, David, about some of the interfacing and back and forth with the contributors? When I hear some of the numbers involved, how many members, how many final contributors, how many pieces came in, the fact that Howard even offhandedly alluded to possibly someday doing a volume 2, that just seems crazy. So much work. I mean, what was that like, interfacing with so many contributors and so many contributions, right? So much wonderful material to go through.
Yeah, I love that question because I could answer it on a couple of levels. The administrative level, which is just that, it's a lot of work, pretty high level of complexity of keeping track of emails, keeping track of just names, contributions, being terrified all the time that oops, did I delete that email, or did I miss that email, or am I leaving someone out? So just cross-checking lists all the time and making sure, and again, everyone was all hands on with that stuff. So the complexity, but I, again, I kind of gravitate toward that kind of work, and I was, I felt like I could be on it without wrecking my life. But then just, also interfacing was a pleasure. For me, it was like it was just one of the many ways in which I've been able to stay within this community. Even though I live abroad, I live in England for the last 2 years. I've been here, and I was in Georgia before that, but I'm a longtime New Yorker. But I feel like I've gone farther and farther from New York, and yet I've stayed close, and also close to people on the West Coast and people in Canada and people, and it's just a pleasure. Some of it was reconnecting with old friends via this email process of, and just kind of sculpting them and getting reminded of the things that they had written over the years and, reading them again. And then just continuing conversations via email. So it's, reconnection. That's kind of on the meta level, what this is about too, is about just, strengthening our community. And we did that just merely by the act of getting this done.
Yeah, that's a wonderful aspect of it. I'm very curious to hear from each of you. Maybe we could go around the table here, but I'm very curious. I'll start with you, David, since we're already here together. Going through all these pieces and reading them so many times, whether it's the pieces that made it into the book or pieces that couldn't, what's something maybe you learned about an artist or a scene or a period of time or even a writer? Did you walk away with any piece of insight that was sort of an aha moment for you?
Well, that's a great question. It makes me want to run and just grab the book really quick. So if someone wants to jump in and answer that first, and
How
I'll
about you,
grab the
Terri?
book.
I think you've spent as much time than anybody with the minutia of the copy.
Right. It's funny because in rereading, I would get to certain pieces and I'd be, glad to be back with this piece again. I'm very familiar with the world of jazz journalism. That's what I am working with professionally for years. But there were so many writers that I was not familiar with. And so being introduced to them was really a pleasure for me. And also being introduced to many artists that were being written about whose work I had not heard. And maybe his name I hadn't heard. So there was a lot of discovery going on.
That's really exciting. That's a great answer. Now see, if I were not close to this project from talking to you all and I heard that alone, that as a music lover, that's the reason to go get this book. That's phenomenal. How about you, Howard? I mean, in your regular work life in this organization, you must just see so much writing. Were there revelations for you in this process?
Oh, I had a good feeling about the overall conglomeration of this material. Again, to see the multiple ways that people can address jazz journalism, jazz criticism, very specific, sometimes very spontaneous, writing about what they hear or what they themselves are doing. Terri didn't mention it, but there's a piece by Leslie Pinchik that she's fond of. Leslie's a writer, but also a pianist, and she wrote a piece that's about what she feels like when she goes on a gig. And it's very immediate. And that was a treat to read. I had read Ted Pankin's piece on Sonny Rollins before, but I just loved the way, again, when I read it's the opening piece, that he's so close to Roy Haynes and Sonny Rollins sitting in the green room with them. And it just comes off, this is what jazz journalism ought to be. We are there with the artists and we're bringing the readers there with the artists, and the artists are comfortable with us, and they can be insightful and enlightening and themselves, and we can deliver that sense of personality. I like Ted Gioia's piece examining whether Amy Winehouse fits as a jazz singer, and how that crossover definitions work or don't work. Nate Chinin's unusual piece on Sun Ra, which was published obscurely. So we've given it a home that it'll be able to be read by people who wouldn't have discovered it otherwise. I'm still happy with my piece about going to Ornette Coleman's birthday party. I mean, I just read it because one of my friends said, "Oh, that really got me to the party." And I haven't read it for a while. And I read it. Yeah, not bad. I did a okay job on that. So I think we have a lot to be proud of in this. And I know that I'm getting messages from the contributors, and people are really pleased to be in this book. They're proud of it. And I just can't imagine a better thing that JJA could have done. It's really works for us as an organization. And I hope it'll work for our colleagues who aren't in the organization and for the field in general, and most of all for the reader listeners, the musicians, the readers, the listeners. That's who the book is aimed at.
That's terrific. David,
Yeah.
did you want to jump in? I saw you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to echo what Howard said about Nate Chinin's piece, and I was really glad that the three of us were actually able to powwow for a second and say, what of yours can we? And he dug up this archival piece that had, that was in a discontinued publication and would never have been found just by browsing around the web. So that was great. Eugene Marlowe's piece about just a first person account of befriending Bill Evans, because that just turned out to be neighbors, and he very accidentally discovered this. He happens to be this pianist. Gene, in addition to being a scholar and writer, is a pianist, and so he's describing his awkward friendship and interaction with the great Bill Evans. Willard Jenkins to be able to have the opportunity to reprint his introduction to his fine book, in which he goes in depth about his own upbringing and his own development as a listener and as a professional, and as a human being. And that's just a very moving account. I love that one. The Jason Berry's piece on Henry Butler and Stephen, is it Henry Butler, and it touches on a lot of what he did with Stephen Bernstein toward the end of his career. So that's I enjoyed that piece very much.
Gary, I wonder if you might be willing to channel the colleague of ours who's not here, Patrick Heinley, and could you talk a little bit about the importance and the role of the image in a book so rich with text? And I know you mentioned earlier being fond of the actual book design and layout. Could you talk a little bit about the role of photography in this?
Well, just as a casual reader, of any book, I enjoy some kind of visual element. So I think in telling these stories, these various jazz stories, the power of the photography in this book really makes a huge contribution. And it's also a nice break. I mean, since it's 600 pages of text, just to break up the text, and let the eyes feast on the image and then return to reading.
Yeah.
So that's just off the top of my head.
How about you, Gary? From a production point of view, is that you and your team handling that? Are you doing the layout and the design and the integration of the photography?
Yeah, once the photographs were submitted, as I said, my partner Sylvia Martinez dealt with making them look as good as possible in the book. One of the reasons why we can take risks on projects like this is because the books are taking advantage of print-on-demand technology, so that if you order the book today, it's printed and it's delivered to you anywhere in the world probably tomorrow. The affordances of that are that we don't have a warehouse full of books somewhere, and there's no financial risk to publishing, taking a flyer on a book. The downside is we're limited by what the technology can do, what it can produce. And so one color photograph in a book makes every page a color print. So having this stuff look good in black and white required us to just lay the book out, get a proof sent to us, look at it, tweak it, get another proof sent to us over and over again, because it wasn't just like going to a printer and seeing what it looked like. There's a little bit of randomness to it. From our perspective, we know it aids the reading process and is a gift to the reader. From a publishing standpoint, we wish photography didn't exist and it hadn't been invented yet. And then you get into the digital side, like the Kindle. I've had to explain to people, every single Kindle book runs on every device that Amazon has ever sold, going back to the first Kindle.
Mm.
So even though resolution and layout and everything else has changed dramatically, they've been disciplined enough to make sure that if you bought a Kindle in the 19th century or whenever the Kindle originally shipped, this book will run just fine on it, which is great if you've got an old Kindle, but it's really terrible if you're trying to do anything tricky with layout or visual quality or resolution. So these are the kind of compromises we have to make. And, to your earlier question about, the thing we appreciate most about the book, I think one of the messages that I take away from it is, we ain't dead yet. Jazz is alive and well and flourishing in many ways, and that books still matter. There's a gravity to having been published in a book and to have this stuff not mimeographed or not sitting on a blog that allows people to take it seriously. And I hope some of the journalists who are quite esteemed at what they do get a little bump in their day jobs by being able to say, hey, look, pal, I'm in a book. It shouldn't be that way, but I know from academia, it certainly carries a lot of weight. And I think it's a durable good that will sit on people's shelves for a long time. I think of it, it may not be a perfect analogy, but I think about, the books by Leonard Feather and Nat Hentoff and Ira Gitler, and this being in kind of that tradition as well.
Yeah. David, hypothetical volume 2. Do you sign up for it, and what do you do differently?
I'm going to sign off. Not just kidding.
Your connection's gone wobbly.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you. Sorry. What was that? I'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll give this some, exposure and live with it for a while. If it's not exactly in the same format or same concept, maybe something that's just a little different. I haven't given that a moment's thought, but maybe not another 600 pages, but another, like some kind of offshoot or a tributary or something like that, as much as I could think of.
So as our time together winds down, Terri, I have to ask you, as someone who's combed through this probably pixel by pixel, are you able to hold it in your hand and not see the flaws? Can you appreciate the monument to this music and to these contributors that you've all built?
I do appreciate it, but I have a terror. It's an ongoing terror of projects that are completed, and then you open it to the exact place where there's an error. I mean, that just happens all the time. So I haven't really looked closely at it.
That's a sign of wisdom and maturity.
I'm confident that we were in such good hands that I think it is almost entirely blemish free.
It's pretty.
The nice thing, though, is if we find something atrocious, we can fix it. We can't go back to people who bought it already, but we can fix the book going forward.
For future, sure.
Well,
that's amazing.
That we discussed with Sylvia when we were making like the last final correction, and I was telling her about my boss at Fantasy who sold Turkish prayer rugs on the side. There was a sideline of his, and he always told us, when we were proofing like umpteen CD packages and trying to avoid errors. And he said that the weavers always leave one bad stitch in their work because only Allah is perfect. that's how I approached it anyway.
That's beautiful.
I've also discovered that a lot of band leaders can't spell the names of the people employed in their bands.
Some evergreen truths never never go away. Howard, let me give the last word to you. So the books arrived, everything was finished. It showed up, you opened the box and held it in your hand. Take us there for that moment, if you would.
Oh man, it wasn't just one book. I've got 125 books that arrived, and doing a mailing to the more than 80 contributors, figuring out how to get it in their hands. But again, I mean, I've been living with it and looking at the different proofs, and just feeling better and better about the Jazz Omnibus. I mean, every time we got another proof, it was better. It was improved and fuller, richer, and I'm just so proud of it. I really am. It only took us about 13 months to get this book together also, which I think is
Nothing.
it was very efficient. And for another volume, what I'd like to see is, yes, color photographs. And if we could figure out how to put sound clips next to the text so you can actually hear what we're talking about. I mean, I think there has to be a real evolution of online books, textbooks, but how to make that happen in paper. And I am glad that this book is in paper also, is the hardbound and the paperback are substantial and they belong on shelves. It's so much easier to read them that way than to go through a 600-page book on an ebook on a Kindle situation. I read a lot of ebooks, but to handle an omnibus or an anthology is very awkward to me. You can find things, of course, searching, but I'm just proud of it. And when I got them, I was not like, oh my God, here's 125 books I have to send out. I was like, oh, good, the books have arrived. Now I can start getting them out to people, you know.
Yeah.
And it's been fun. It's been fun.
Yeah. Well, it's a tremendous contribution to the literature. It's a tribute to the music, and it's such a strong foundation for the next 125 years of the music. So thank you all for working so hard on it, and thank you for making time today. It's been great to talk with you. Thank you, David Adler, Terri Hinte, Howard Mandel, Gary Stager, Patrick Heinle, and the more than 85 writers and photographers who shared their skill, wisdom, insight, and generosity to produce a timeless contribution to music criticism, history, and scholarship. Thank you also to our editor, Wiz Petta. Don't miss new episodes of The Buzz. Make sure you follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information from the Jazz Journalists Association, go to jjanews.org. I'm Lawrence Peryer. Thanks for listening.